Hi, and welcome to Bible Study with Friends. I'm here with my friends, a number of beautiful ladies, and we are going to be continuing our Bible study in the women of Christ's life and ministry. And we're in the section studying the women in Christ's genealogy from Matthew chapter 1. And today we're going to be talking about Ruth, the widow seeking a family. And we're going to be talking about Ruth when we come back. Hi, and welcome back to Bible Study with Friends. I'm here with my friends Beverly, my beautiful wife, and Kathy, and Jan, and Sherry. And we're going to be discussing, as I said, Ruth, the person of Ruth in the genealogy of Christ. And Ruth, there's only two places in the scripture that Ruth is mentioned. One is in Matthew chapter 1, verse 5, and the other is in the Book of Ruth. And now, there are some skeptics that say, ladies, that because Ruth is only mentioned in those two places, that she is fictitious. But I would remind you that for over 200 years, scholars, skeptics, thought that the Hittites, who are mentioned in the scriptures, that the Hittites were fictitious because there was no proof of the Hittite nation other than what the Bible said about them. And in the last 10 years, they have found the capital of the Hittite nation, and archaeology has proven that it was not only a big city, it was a big nation. And so archaeology has validated the scriptures. So just because we have not yet found anything mentioning Ruth doesn't mean that she is not a valid person in the scripture. And she's referred to a number of times in the scriptures as being a godly woman, and we're going to talk about her today. So how are you ladies?
Good.
Very good.
Everybody ready to get into this, right?
Right.
Yes.
Yes.
All right. Now, the story of Ruth is fairly familiar to a lot of people, but we may have some viewers on YouTube that it's not really that familiar a story. Do any of you want to sum up the story of Ruth? Give us a kind of a Cliff Notes. Any volunteers?
You have to pick a volunteer.
You know, when you ask a question, the first person that talks loses. So
That's right. That's me.
Bev, why don't you give us a recap?
Well, first of all, Ruth's mother-in-law and her father-in-law came with their two sons to another country. They left because of a famine, I think. I remember that.
We're going to read
And
those verses
they went to the land of.
So keep going with
Okay.
your story.
They went to the land of Moab, where the two sons married Moabite women, and the father and the two sons died and left Naomi with her two daughters-in-law. And they found out that the famine had eased up in Judah, and they went back. But the mother-in-law, Naomi, told her two daughters-in-law to go back home to their mothers, to their families. And one went, and the other one, Ruth, stayed with her mother-in-law. And they ended up living in back where they had come from. And Ruth, Naomi was known there, and everybody knew that she had come back without her family. Do you want me to go through the whole thing?
No. She ends up marrying who?
Oh, she ends up marrying Boaz, who was a Kinsman-Redeemer. It was a family, and the story of having a Kinsman-Redeemer is said about in different areas of the Bible.
Yeah, we're gonna talk more about that in a minute. That's one of the great aspects of the story of Ruth. So that's good. That's Cliff Notes. We're basically talking about two widows. We're talking about Naomi and Ruth. Naomi is the mother-in-law, and Ruth. In fact, if we turn, let me screen share. Now let me just read this first couple of verses. It came about in the days when the judges governed. This is during the judges period, that there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem of Judah. Now, that's kind of cool, because who else do we know that's from Bethlehem? Jesus.
Somebody very special, a king.
Yes. Now, the word Bethlehem means house of bread, which is kind of cool because Jesus later says, I am the bread of life. So we have a connection back to the coming Messiah, and there's going to be more than one connection between Ruth and the coming Messiah, and we're going to get into that as we go. But anyway, they are of Bethlehem in Judah, and they went to sojourn in the land of Moab. Now, ladies, where geographically is Moab from Judah?
It is to the right.
The east?
To the east, on the other side of the Dead Sea.
That's right. It's across the Jordan River, and it's from the east, and it wraps around the south side and butts up against Egypt. So we're talking about, they didn't go far, perhaps 400 miles, something like that, but it was quite a trip. And so they go to the land of Moab, and he goes with his wife and his two sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of the wife Naomi. And the names of the two sons were Mahlon and Chilion. And their last name is Ephrathitis. Okay? Ephrathitis of Bethlehem and Judah. And they entered the land of Moab, and they remained there. Now, I wanted to give that background because they're from Bethlehem, and Naomi comes with her husband. So she's already married to Elimelech, and she comes. She's Jewish. Elimelech is Jewish. The two sons are Jewish, but they do not marry Jewish women. They marry Moabite women, which one of the early things in the law was that Jews should not marry women that were not Jewish.
But if you're not in Judah, if you're not from your country, it's kind of hard to find other Jewish women.
Well, in the scriptures, what did they do?
They sent for a bride.
They sent for a bride, yeah. But Elimelech didn't do that. Now, that may be because they were poor. It may be because of any number of reasons. But they were not in a financial place where they could send somebody to go get a couple of wives and bring them back. So they married local women, Moabites. And
we agree, yes.
We can stop here and go back to our conversation. So we have already studied, Tamar in the line of Christ, and we've studied Rahab in the line of Christ, and now we're at Ruth. So one of the questions that we talked about was, what does Tamar and Rahab and Ruth have in common?
They're Gentiles.
They're all Gentiles.
And they are single Gentile women at the time.
Yeah, they're single women, single Gentile women who ultimately get folded in to the Jewish nation.
Do we know that of course I missed Rahab. Do we know that she was single? Could she have had a husband?
No, because when she talks about her household, she talks about brothers and sisters and fathers and mothers, but not a husband.
Okay.
So anyway, we see here that's got in common. Now, what is hugely significant about the fact that these three women were Gentiles?
That they're in the line of Jesus' bloodline, the lineage.
Yeah, and that the line in Matthew is the Jewish line of the Messiah.
Right.
This is the Messiah and the lineage of Messiah, and three women, the first three women that are mentioned. Number one, women are mentioned. That's significant in and of itself. But the three women that are mentioned as progenitors in the line of Christ are all Gentile women. Now that is a a hint that we're going to see fulfilled in Ruth, and we're going to see an interesting verse in Ruth. But the fact that these are Gentile women and that they're folded into the line of Christ, they are welcomed as members of the nation of Jews in the same way that you and I, as Gentiles, are welcomed into the family of Christ. And that is a significant thing. That is a blessing for all of us, because I don't think any of us here in this meeting come from a Jewish background. I know a number of Messianic Jews, but it's good news for us Gentiles in that the first three women of Christ's lineage were by providence, chosen by God, to be Gentile women and establish some significant rights as Gentile women, right?
Beautiful.
Yes.
Now, what else in the story, before we get into our next discussion question, what else in the story of Ruth and Naomi, what else jumps out at you? What else really impressed you as you did your research into Ruth? Was there any other point that was interesting?
How dedicated Ruth was to Naomi and Naomi's God.
Okay. Now it's interesting that originally Naomi is widowed, and she has two daughter-in-laws, right?
Right.
And she says to the daughter-in-laws, I'm going back to Israel, back to Bethlehem. And both daughter-in-laws go with her, start to go with her. And she says, no, really, you need to go back to your family. And one finally does, and the other one, Ruth, stays with her. What do you think it is about Naomi that her daughter-in-laws are so dedicated to her?
Because of how dedicated and loving she is to them.
Okay, and how do we know that she is loving towards them?
I don't think you'd want to follow somebody who wasn't,
Well, yeah, but what is it in the scriptures that we see that's kind of a hint how loving she was towards her daughter-in-laws? When she decided to go back to Israel, what was her concern?
Husbands for them.
Yeah. She said, you guys, I'm old. I'm too old to get remarried. I'm going back to where I know people and where I have some kinsmen. But you guys are young enough to be remarried. And so my concern for you is your future, so you need to go back to your families. So the first thing she shows is concern for them, not concern for the fact that she'll be all alone, traveling and all alone when she gets to Israel. There was no Social Security, so it was going to be an older widow on her own would have been at the mercy of her family, or literally begging.
It's almost like she was trying to release them to go back and find another family to be with.
And whose interest was it to release them? Was it her interest, or
it would have been theirs, because she didn't know what circumstances Naomi would be in when she returned home with no guarantee of any kind of support.
Now we see that because when they do go back, Ruth and Naomi go back, who's the one that takes care of getting the food and taking care of the household?
Ruth.
It's Ruth. It's the daughter-in-law. Because Naomi is really too old to go out in the fields and do the harvesting and that sort of thing. So Ruth goes out and does that. So really Naomi was, in a way, out of care for her daughter-in-laws, really cutting her own throat as far as any kind of support, any kind of help.
It's interesting how Ruth was young enough to take care of and supply for them. Naomi was old enough to have the wisdom to give her to be able to understand how to take care of them.
Sure. So
they work together.
I think it is really significant that we have two Gentile women who both show a real favorable attitude towards their mother-in-law.
True.
And I think that says a lot about Naomi as a mother-in-law. That
Yes.
the first instinct of both these women was to stay and help her, but she really insists, and then we get the famous exchange.
16 and 17.
Yeah, in verse 16 and 17. One of you want to read chapter 1, Ruth chapter 1, verse 16 and 17?
So Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. See, where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you and me."
The fact that she says that I'm going to go where you're going to go, and your people will be my people.
Yes.
And your God, my God.
Your God, my God. In fact, she calls God Lord, Elohim. So she is acknowledging that she has a faith in the God of Naomi, and the fact that she says, your people will be my people. Now, what's interesting is the Book of Ruth, we don't know who wrote the Book of Ruth, and it's written somewhere, they don't know exactly when, but it's written somewhere between 1300 and 1000 BC. Now, we know that because that is the time of the judges in the history of Israel. And the book says this was during the time of the judges. So scholars believe that it was written somewhere in that 300-year period, right? Now, up to 500 years later, the book of Hosea is written. And Bev, I want you to turn to Hosea chapter 2, verse 23. And we're going to especially look at the second half of the verse and how it relates to you and I and how it relates to Ruth. Ruth set a precedent 500 years earlier, but let's read that verse. Hosea chapter 2, verse 23.
I will sow for her for myself in the land. I will also have compassion on her who had not obtained compassion. And I will say to those who were not my people, you are my people. And they will say, you are my God.
So there is this very reminiscent of God speaking to the Gentiles of the land, saying, I'm going to provide for you. It isn't just about the Jews. I'm going to provide for you. And you're going to be my people, and I'm going to be your God. The same phraseology that Ruth uses hundreds of years earlier. And as a Gentile, she is folded right into the people of God. And just like we are as Christians, we are fulfilling Hosea and fulfilling in Ruth, that we as Gentiles are folded right into the family of God. The next question was the idea that, and we've talked about the idea of why did she stay with Naomi. Now, it says something about Ruth that she stayed with Naomi. Now, one of the things was she was making a statement of faith about the God of Israel and the people of Israel, right? Your people will be my people, and I will, and God will be my God, right? But it also shows a characteristic of Ruth, of why she wanted to stay instead of going back. She could have been a person of God and gone back to her family and remarried. But why? What does it say about Ruth that she stays with Naomi?
She's loyal.
Loyal. And what else? Why does she stay? What is she going to do when she stays with Naomi? What's going to be her function?
Her caretaker.
Yeah, she's gonna be a servant of Naomi. She's gonna serve Naomi, which is a very New Testament thing that we as Christians are to be in service of others. We serve the Lord by serving others.
I think what was really special was Ruth really didn't know the Jewish culture either. And so she listened to everything Naomi would tell her, because if I were in a foreign land, I would want to do that as well. But again, that takes trust on Ruth's part.
And obedience, yeah, really does. Because Naomi was the one who knew where the fields were.
Yes.
Naomi was the one who knew that there was a tradition in Israel that when they gleaned, when they cleaned off and harvested a field, they always left a lot of leavings so that the poor could come. This was even in Jesus' day, that the poor could come along. And at one point, Jesus and the disciples are walking along a road, and the disciples just pick some grain out of the field because it's leftover. And they left it there for poor people to be able to get some food. And Naomi knew that. Ruth would not have been aware of that tradition. But Naomi said, you go and you work, you can glean out of the field, and then you bring the bag of grain back to me. And there's a lot about these women that is a terrific characteristic that we can look at and say, that's a characteristic for all of us. But you women can say, this is a great characteristic of godly women in our society today. Obedient, trusting, women of faith, willing to step out in faith even into some unknown situations. And sometimes God uses circumstances in our life to take us into unknown situations that really demand a certain amount of faith from us.
And I think what's so special is that Ruth didn't know that she would be inserted into the bloodline of Jesus. And so God did see her, and as we're walking in obedience and faith, and we don't know the outcome, God sees it.
Yeah.
And how important it is that our motives are correct,
Yeah, and now there were some scholars that said that Elimelech and Naomi should never have left Israel, but it was a very typical thing during famines. You remember the story of Joseph. The entire family of his brothers came to Egypt because of a famine. So it was very typical to leave Israel when it was a famine. You couldn't provide for your family. You'd go somewhere. And I think it's that they went not outside of God's will, but in fact to have this specific encounter with these Gentile women who married their sons, and God provided this example of folding in a Gentile person right into the line of Christ. And that's God's grace, it's God's providence. So the story picks up. We're back in Israel. We're back at Bethlehem.
Judah.
And Naomi gives Ruth instructions to go out in the field and glean, and she does. Now, when she's out there, somebody notices her. Boaz notices her. Now, Boaz is a fairly rich Jew. We know that because he has servants in the field, and he sees this widow, and it's significant that he knows who she is because her reputation, Ruth's reputation as coming back with her mother-in-law, Naomi, coming back and settling back with the families. He knows who she is, and he gives instructions to the servants: don't bother her, don't molest her while she's in the fields, because she's doing the work of one of my kinsmen. She's taking care of Naomi, right?
Must have been a fairly small town for everybody when Naomi and Ruth came back. They all knew Naomi, and they all knew she came back without her husband and her sons, and so word of this had spread.
Now remember, Bethlehem is a small town. It was a small town when Jesus was born, and it
was back then.
1,000 years earlier, it's a small town. So they're there, and Boaz notices her, knows who she is. Now I want to talk a little bit about the attraction. Read chapter 2, Ruth chapter 2, verse 11 and 12, and somebody else read chapter 3, verse 10.
May the Lord reward your work, and your wages be full from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to seek refuge. Then she said, I have found favor in your sight, my Lord, for you have comforted me, and indeed have spoken kindly to your maidservant. though I am not like one of your maidservants.
Okay. So basically he says, I know who you are, and I know that you're serving Naomi. And so good for you. Basically he says, and I know you've left your Gentile nation and you've come to be part of us, and good for you, right? Now read chapter 3, verse 10.
And he said, "May you be blessed of the Lord, my daughter. You have shown your last kindness to be better than the first by not going after young men, whether poor or rich."
Now, the question that I wanted us to talk about was, what do you think Boaz found attractive in Ruth? And those are two scriptures that give hints.
Her loyalty.
Her loyalty, her willingness to serve. We saw that in the first verses.
And she wasn't just out just to get a husband or find some young, attractive man. She was willing to stay and help her old mother-in-law.
And there's in chapter 3, verse 10, there's a very interesting word that he acknowledges about her. Do you see?
You have shown your last kindness.
Kindness. All right. Now it's interesting that Boaz in the fields in chapter 2 shows kindness towards Ruth. And here he says Ruth is showing kindness towards him in that he is significantly older than she is. And she is not going after men her own age, younger men. She has, per Naomi's instructions, she has gone and sat at the feet of Boaz, and she asks Boaz. The significance of that is she goes and sits down lays down at his feet, and when he wakes up, she's there, and she asks for his protection as the Kinsman-Redeemer. That's basically what she's asking for, and he says she's basically saying, I'm available to be your wife if you are willing to be the Kinsman-Redeemer. Now, the Kinsman-Redeemer goes back to Tamar. And you remember the Levite marriage thing, that if a husband of a woman died without having children, the next kin would marry her so that the line of her husband would continue, right?
Right.
And the Kinsman-Redeemer was, if there's not a son of the same father-in-law, there's got to be some relative somewhere who will redeem that woman by providing an offspring.
And they have to be willing.
And they had to be willing to do it.
I thought it was interesting later on when there's someone nearer to Naomi, and he says, yeah, I'll buy the land, but then he didn't want to do it when he knew that Ruth came with the deal.
Yeah, that Ruth and Naomi both came with the deal, that he said, no.
Never mind.
And there was a ceremony with the shoe that basically he gave up his rights and said, okay, I'm going to give up my rights as the nearest kinsman redeemer. And that's where Boaz is a picture of Jesus. As the kinsman redeemer, he's willing to step up and be the kinsman redeemer for this Gentile woman and Naomi.
And he gives up all his rights.
And he gives up his rights as a single, man in order to extend the line of Elimelech. And
that could have been scandalous too, because he's marrying a Moabite woman.
A Moabite and a much younger woman. I mean, there's all kinds of issues. But it's significant that what's the response when he marries her? What's the response of the community? What do the other women in the community say?
They're happy.
Yeah, I mean, they're excited. In fact, they say a blessing. Go all the way to the end.
4:11.
In chapter 4, verse let's start up. In fact, let me go to this. I'll turn to this. Verse 13 says, "So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and he went into her, and the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. Then the women," okay, so this is the women of the community, "they said to Naomi, the grandmother, 'Blessed is the Lord who has not left you without a redeemer today, and may his name become famous in Israel.'" Now, it's not clear whether the name is the name of Boaz or the name of the child. Either one of them could be considered her redeemer, as in redeeming her from being a supportless widow. And then it goes on. And then they're continuing to talk, and they're saying, "May he also be to you a restorer of life and a sustainer of your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him." Then Naomi took the child and laid her in her lap and became her nurse, or became his nurse, a wet nurse. The neighbor women gave him a name. "A son has been born to Naomi." So they named him Obed. And Obed, the word Obed means servant. And he is the father of Jesse, the father of David. And it goes on. Now it's very interesting here that twice in the book of Ruth, Tamar is mentioned, and the connection between Tamar and Naomi. The first time is verse 12. Somebody read chapter 4, verse 12.
"Moreover, may your house be like the house of Perez, who Tamar bore to Judah, through the offspring which the Lord will give you by this young woman."
Okay, now read verse 18.
"Now these generations of Perez, to Perez was born Hezron."
Now who's Perez?
Tamar's son?
Yeah, Tamar's son. Yeah.
Okay.
So Tamar is mentioned twice in the book of Ruth as connected to the new family of Ruth through Naomi. And so even the book of Ruth connects them. And then back in Matthew chapter 1 connects them. So the comparison here is the joy that this Gentile woman brings to not only Naomi, but it's a joy that is shared by the whole town. There's no indication at all of any women saying, "Well, yeah, she's a Gentile, yeah, blah, blah, blah." There's total, because of her attitude towards Naomi and Boaz's acceptance as the Kinsman-Redeemer, she is accepted in and folded right into the family. And that is that picture of grace to Gentiles that we all of us here, can be blessed by and appreciate the fact that God is totally willing to be our people the same way that he was God's people, and he can be our God the same way that Israel is accepting him as their God.
So Tamar lived before Ruth.
Oh,
Is
yeah.
that correct?
Oh,
yeah, way before Ruth. Okay.
In the lineage, she was something like 2 or 3 generations earlier through Perez, in the line of Christ, and basically Perez is in the line of Boaz, and that's how Boaz, and then Boaz through Ruth produces David, ultimately.
And that's Matthew 1:1-6.
Yeah.
Lays that out.
Exactly right. Yeah. So Tamar is first, then Rahab is next in the line. Rahab is directly the grandparent of Boaz. Then Boaz is going to be through Ruth that produce David. So anybody want to kind of sum up a takeaway for us? A takeaway for you as modern women. We've seen these 3 very strong women who were without support systems and yet took an action of faith. Now, Tamar's action of faith was when she played the harlot with Judah, she was taking a real chance, a real step of faith to get her offspring, because she could have been labeled a harlot and killed. Except Judah finally says, "Oh man, I realize I'm the father," and he repents. That was a real step of faith for her, and it was a step of faith for Rahab. And it was a step of faith for Ruth. Anybody from a woman's perspective want to make any comment on these women?
Well, I think that I can trust in the Lord with all my heart, that he would work things out for myself and future generations. And that's big to me. As a woman, I like protection. So I also like the idea of the Kinsman-Redeemer, which really Jesus Christ is for us.
And that really, this is a great example of Romans 8:28, that all things work together for good. Now, the things may not be good in themselves. Being a widow is not fun. Being, and going through the difficulties that Tamar went through, or that Rahab went through with those things, those were not fun. But God can use them as a sovereign God. He can use them to do good for not only the people involved, but for future generations.
And along with faith and trust, I think we have to have the courage to follow our own convictions. A lot of times, I can say, I trust you, Lord, but then can I really trust myself and have the courage to go do what I think you're telling me to do?
And convictions, it isn't just having convictions, because there are a lot of women, a lot of people that have convictions that have nothing to do with God. It's about having convictions about who God is and being willing to take that step of faith based upon the conviction of who God is and what he is able to do for us. So
I think as a woman, for me, it's being vulnerable enough to let him love me and let me see that. So I become more and more solid in him.
Yeah, that's great, Sherry. Thank you. Well, let's end here. Thank you guys for watching. Hope this has been a blessing to you on YouTube, and we'd love to hear your comments about Ruth and even about Rahab and Tamar. We'd love to hear what you think and how God works sovereignly in your life to your good. And we appreciate you spending the time with us. And thank you, ladies, for spending the time with me today in Bible Study with Friends. And our goal is to show and grow a passion for studying God's Word. And even if we don't go through verse by verse, we can be totally blessed by looking at God's Word and seeing how it applies to our lives. And we hope that has been the case for you. And in the meantime, we're going to see you all next week. God bless you. See you then.